Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Sansky. I'm the Deputy Director of the China and the World Program. I say that mostly because I forget to introduce myself often at these talks. Today we have a special guest, Anatol Klass, one of this year's fellows at the China and the World Program. He's a current fellow for 2024-2025 academic year. He is a historian with research interests focused on 20th century China. Anatol's first book project examines the bureaucratic development of the institutions through which the Chinese state engages with the world and the professional identities of experts working within those institutions. Anatol comes to us having recently received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 2024. Please give a warm welcome to Anatol Klass.
Can everyone hear me okay? Well, speak up on the Zoom chat if it doesn't come through clearly. Thanks so much, Daniel, for that introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here, either in the room or on Zoom. It's been wonderful to be here at Columbia this semester, and I'm excited to share some of what I've been working on with the group. I'm a historian by training, and I'm somebody who focuses on how the Chinese state developed its own set of institutions and ideas for making foreign policy over the course of the 20th century. It's a story, I argue, that starts before 1949 and has an inheritance even after the revolution from bureaucratic and intellectual transformations in the first half of the 20th century. And it's also a story that happens in parallel with other developments around the world. So there's been a great deal of work done on the modernization of the American Foreign Service or European foreign ministries during the 20th century. And this story is happening in China at around the same time as, say, the creation of the US State Department in its modern form, or even the creation of schools like SIPA or Georgetown SFS, which are brought into being in order to train the nation's bureaucrats and diplomats. So I'm interested in putting the Chinese story in that global historical context and thinking about those parallels, but also taking seriously the ways in which this case is distinct. First of all, it's distinct because it's happening at a time when China is outside the center of the international system. It begins when China is not fully sovereign, but is still under a system of semi-imperialism because of the unequal treaties. And much of these transformations are shaped by this quest for sovereignty. It's also distinct because it's wrapped up in the specific politics and intellectual movements of mid-20th century China. So I use this historical framework to think about the genealogy of China's contemporary foreign policy system, and also to try to shed light on some of the ways that the Chinese government makes foreign policy choices today. For example, why, when Chinese leaders look at the conflict in Ukraine, they see their natural allies not necessarily being the same as those that we see in European governments and in the United States, or what it means for China to be exporting the idea of a party school to Africa and opening a shiny new campus for leaders from authoritarian political parties around the continent to come and learn different methods of gaining and holding onto power. So the research I'm going to be talking about today comes from my first book project, as Daniel said, and one of the things that I'm going to try to do in this talk is give you an overview of that project as a whole, some of the arguments that I make across the book, also some of the sources that I'm using, the archives that I draw upon, as well as the historiographical debates that I'm engaging with. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the developments that start before 1949, what's happening in the 1930s and 1940s as China tries to remake its foreign service and build up its diplomatic capacity. And I'm going to end by looking at the legacy of those transformations after 1949 in the PRC. What is the inheritance that the new state gets from predecessor regimes in the Chinese mainland? So more specifically, my project is a group biography of 130 foreign policy experts who graduated from the Kuomintang Party School in the 1930s. They were brought to this campus in Nanjing throughout the 1930s as college students, as 18-year-olds, after being selected to take part in this specialized training program in diplomacy, in which the government tried to instill the skills and expertise that they thought were going to be essential for their next generation of diplomats. And you can see on the left the gate of the school, which is still standing in Nanjing. It's still there, but it now marks the entrance to a Communist Party school in the same location. You can see on the right the lyrics of the school song, which were written by one of the Kuomintang's most notorious right-wing ideologues. And the song starts with, "Politics is the art of managing the affairs of the people, and we are the ones who manage the affairs of the people." So along with thinking about foreign policy choices that these experts would make later on in their careers, I'm very interested in what it means that this is happening at a party school, an institution which we're all very familiar with from 21st century Chinese governance, but that in fact begins before 1949. And it's part of an effort to train technocrats who not only have the necessary expertise for the jobs they're going to take on upon graduation, but who also have the necessary political credentials, who are as well versed in party ideology, the three principles of the people, as they are in foreign languages and international politics. And I follow this group of 130 students who go through this program from the time they first enter, when the curriculum is still being created by party leaders, through their graduation and their early careers when they join the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then I look at what happens to them after 1949 at the moment of the completion of the Chinese Revolution. And there are a few central research questions that animate this project. The first is, what exactly do we learn from this kind of genealogical history of China's foreign policy system? What can we tell about how it works today and its nature as compared to other diplomatic services around the world? Second, this is the kind of question that historians are very into. I'm wondering how much we should think of 1949 as a moment of rupture or continuity, as I've already suggested in my remarks. And if we see some continuity, what does that suggest to us about possible parallels that could be seen across the straits in China and Taiwan after 1949, if they're drawing on a shared legacy? And then finally, in that global perspective, I'm wondering why resource-constrained states that are still struggling to establish their own national hold on power would choose to devote significant money, significant time, significant effort to building up a foreign policy establishment, even when they have not necessarily finished consolidating power within the country. Why is this a part of nation building? Why is this a part of managing the affairs of the people? So to provide some quick answers to those three questions, first, I argue that there is a vast and decentralized foreign policy system, which feeds up to the top where policymakers make the final decision, but it's a huge constellation of specialized agencies and experts which gather information about the world, interpret that information, and make policy recommendations. And that probably sounds familiar because most foreign policy decision-making apparatuses rest on top of that kind of information system. But most of the institutions that we're talking about in the Chinese case have their roots in this mid-century transformation of Chinese foreign policy. Second, I argue that there is much more continuity than previous studies and previous research on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would suggest. So from historians of the early PRC period, they've been arguing for continuity for a long time. They've found in many parts of Chinese governance and society that the rupture of 1949 was not as complete as the Communist Party generally presents it to be, and that in fact there was a great deal of institutional and cultural carryover from before and after 1949, but for whatever reason, accounts of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have usually been left out of this continuity thesis. If you've taken a course on the history of Chinese foreign policy, it probably starts with Zhou Enlai on October 1st, 1949, dispatching a bunch of PLA soldiers to ride around Beijing on bicycles and tell all of the ambassadors that all of old China's diplomatic relations are severed, all of its treaties are abrogated, and the new nation will begin anew. And that did really happen, but as I try to show in my research, beyond that sort of theatricality, there was a great deal of institutional carryover. And then finally, I make the argument that it's precisely because of internal weakness that states like China in the middle decades of the 20th century placed such a high premium on developing the ability to establish their sovereignty from without. It's because of the challenges to sovereignty from within that you see states trying to build up their international capacity and their international recognition over the course of the 20th century. I think that's not just true for China during this time period, it continues to be true for young and resource-constrained states. So I did the research for this project in Taiwan in 2021 and 2022 when the borders were closed, and I arrived and spent 2 weeks locked in this hotel room, slowly losing my mind, but eventually they did let me out, and I did the research for this project in about 4 or 5 archives around Taipei, mainly in the Kuomintang Party archives, the Party School archives, which are kept at a university in Taipei called zhengzhi, which is the successor institution to the Party School, the Foreign Ministry archives, which are kept between Academia Historica and Academia Sinica. And I spent about 6 months collecting as much information as I could about these 130 individuals. I started out by trying to go through the somewhat tiring process of getting their personnel files declassified. They were all protected by privacy laws, but eventually I was able to get access to most of them, and I could start collecting biographical data about who these people were, both before they joined the party and went to the school, and afterwards in their later careers. This includes not only stuff like where they were born and who their sponsor was when they joined the party, it also includes secret police reports that were kept on all of them throughout the middle decades of the 20th century, recommendations that were written for them by their bosses and their professors, and various kinds of reporting that they did on one another during certain decades in Taiwan's early history. And I started to find that this was a new kind of expert within the Chinese government. These were people who had not previously been part of the system, and they had expertise that had not previously been part of the system. So I don't know if I have a pointer, but on the left, you can see the personnel file for Jiang Weide, who was the first female member of China's Foreign Service when she joined upon graduating in 1940. You can see on her file that she was actually introduced to the party by the same right-wing ideologue who wrote the school song, C&WP, that was her sponsor when she joined the party. On the right, you can see Zheng Jiansheng, who was a few years younger than her and became the first Africa expert after a few years in the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs until he was killed in a tragic car accident in Mbabane as the ambassador. And these new experts also began to institutionalize their particular skills and knowledge in new departments within the ministry. This is when you start to see regional sub-departments coming into being, like the Department of African Affairs and many others like it, that not only focused on different areas around the world, but different sets of issues like international law, like technology, like communication, that were becoming increasingly essential to China's diplomatic work. And in 1949, as I've already started to suggest, this group, this cohort, bifurcated, and almost exactly half of the students who had graduated from the Kuomintang Party School went to Taiwan with the party that had trained them and continued to work in the Republic of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, while almost exactly half, a slightly smaller number, but almost exactly half, stayed in the mainland and continued their careers in the People's Republic of China, now in a very different political context. So I use all of this information from these personnel files from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs documents to construct a biographical database about these 130 people that helps me understand a few demographic trends about where they're coming from in China, what kinds of family backgrounds they have, but more importantly, helps me track the ways in which they remain a meaningful professional network, even after they've graduated. Every student who was in this department was guaranteed a post in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs upon graduation, so they did all join and work as diplomats, but they were obviously a small percentage of a much larger organization. And yet what I find when I track what kinds of issues they worked on, what kinds of departments they worked in, I see that they continued to go through their careers in lockstep, working for and with one another and with their younger classmates, and remains this sort of very much an embedded network within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for decades, even after the party school has ceased to exist. So I'm not going to linger for too long on historiography. I'll just mention that this is a topic which touches on some of the oldest debates in my field, especially ones that came out of the Who Lost China debate in American academia, in which different professors tried to assess why the Kuomintang state had collapsed. And there's an early set of scholarship that says there were essential problems with the political vision of Chiang Kai-shek that made it impossible for it ever to be an effective state. In other words, the political vision had the seeds of destruction planted in it from the very start. And then there's a later set of scholarship by people like Julia Strauss that sees more modest gains being made by the Kuomintang during their decade in power on the mainland, and tries to understand the serious governance steps forward that were being taken during this time period. And I owe a lot to both schools of scholarship here, but I'm less interested in giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down to the governance of the 1930s. I'm less interested in saying it was a big success or a big failure. Rather, I want to think about it as part of a longue durée process of Chinese state building that begins before the 1930s and continues on after the Kuomintang have left the scene. There's also been a set of books in very recent years about right-wing ideology and its place in the Kuomintang regime. And most of these books are trying to make the case that Chinese authoritarianism today still has some ties to the Kuomintang's right-wing ideology in the 1920s and the 1930s. And though that's not exactly my argument, I'm also interested in thinking about the ways that the politics of that era continue to influence Chinese governance today. And then finally, there have been a set of books about Chinese foreign policy, and specifically the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the PRC, largely inspired by the rise of Xi Jinping and his wolf warriors, as you can see from the titles of these books. And again, right, I have some agreements and some disagreements with all of these titles, but largely I think these are books that interpret the history of Chinese foreign policy, waiting for Xi Jinping and the wolf warriors to arrive. They're trying to say, this is the destination point, how did we get here? And I think that if you look at it from the opposite angle and think about sort of the historical progression without this as the established endpoint, it's a slightly different picture. And then finally, just a word on methodology, right? Group biography is not the most common method that you see in either history or political science, and I take a lot of inspiration from books that I love and that I think do a really effective job of communicating how sort of human networks are at the heart of government institutions. So two books that I think are probably never on a slide together before and never will be again. On the right, you can see Iona Manchong's book about all of the test takers who passed Emperor Qianlong's imperial bureaucracy examination in 1761 and the careers that followed. And on the left, you can see Kenneth Weisbrod's book about the diplomats who built up the European Affairs Department of the American State Department. So I've been talking a lot about group biography. Here's the group. These are students from the Kuomintang Party School in the 1930s. On the sides, you can see students who are in military uniform who have biked over to watch their classmates participate in a track meet. And students were required to wear those military uniforms anytime they left campus. It was part of what marked these cadres as being outside the general student culture of Nanjing in the 1930s. The school was founded in 1927, before the Kuomintang had finished consolidating their control over the Chinese mainland, and it was originally a place for training revolutionaries. It was the party school of a party that was still revolutionary, not in power. It had a lot of instructors from the Soviet Union. The Kuomintang was a Leninist party, and they had a lot of advisors from the Soviet Union, and those Soviet teachers taught classes on important subjects like how do you infiltrate an enemy party's meetings? How do you bust up a student protest? All the things that you need to do when you are still carrying on your revolution. But in 1928, when the regime is established in Nanjing, it goes from being a revolutionary party school to being a civil service party school. They're now in control of this large and fractious territory, and they need people who can help them administer it. And instead of just having a class of about 100 cadres with no specific focus, you start to see departments. One is going to train judges, one is going to train local mayors, one is going to train journalists, and starting in 1930, there's a diplomacy department that goes directly to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs upon completion and receiving a degree. To lead this new department, Kuomintang party leaders tapped Xu Mo, who at that point was a deputy minister of foreign affairs. He was quite young. He was a rising star in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he would later become very famous as the first Chinese justice on the International Court of Justice, which is the post he would hold until his death in 1956. But when he was chosen to lead this new department in 1930, he was representative of what we might call the elite generalist model of Chinese diplomacy. This was the model that had been popular throughout the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and it applies to most of the most famous names of mid-century Chinese diplomacy. People like Wellington Koo were elite generalists. They were people who did not have any specific training, any specific set of expertise, but had a very cosmopolitan background, had been educated overseas, and they knew the right people. Not just in China, but more importantly, overseas. They knew their French and British and American counterparts and were comfortable at the negotiating table, but also at a dinner party, right? And it was assumed that whatever problems came up for China diplomatically, these kinds of people would be the most able to put forward China's interests with international interlocutors. However, Xu Mo was not being selected to produce more elite generalists. Instead, the party had a very different idea of what the next generation of diplomats should be able to do. So this is a speech by the school's dean in which he says what he thinks the school's diplomacy department should be teaching. He says, if our party wants to have a revolutionary diplomacy, it certainly cannot be figures of the comprador bourgeoisie or members of the Young Men's Christian Association who assume the posts. In the past, the general mentality was that diplomats could conduct foreign affairs only if they could dance and eat Western-style meals. This is simply silly. Of course, I do not expect that our diplomats need not be able to eat Western food, putting knives in their mouths and cutting their own tongues to become the subject of foreigners' jokes. However, it is not acceptable for eating Western food and dancing to be taken as the only criteria for diplomats. So if you're not going to teach how to eat with a knife and fork and you're not going to teach how to dance, what are you going to teach instead? This is the first handwritten curriculum that they come up with in 1930. If it's a little bit hard to read, here it is in English. And again, I mentioned this is part of a global trend of diplomatic professionalization. When they put together the first curriculum, they use foreign models, and the model they follow most closely is Sciences Po. And what they think Sciences Po is teaching its young diplomats is, first of all, foreign languages, second of all, diplomatic history, and then a little bit of international law, a sort of a general training in the social sciences. And parts of this curriculum, particularly the emphasis on foreign languages, stay the same over the course of the decade. However, when students start to graduate and they take up their posts, they go overseas and they learn these are not the skills that are most important to us. These are not the issues that are most important for Chinese diplomats in embassies around the world. And they come back to the school and start teaching courses on what they consider to be the most essential skills. Some of them are very specific. Some of them want to teach a class on how to balance a budget in an consulate in British Malaya. Some of them want to teach courses on anti-colonial politics. Some of them want to teach courses on the political leanings of overseas Chinese communities in North America. But increasingly, things like commercial law and the Western diplomatic history get replaced by courses on the nuts and bolts of administration within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or new issue areas that the graduates believe are more important than this Sciences Po derived curriculum. So one of those students who comes back to teach at the university is Zhu Jianmin, who was in the very first graduating class. After he leaves the school in 1933, he is appointed as consular staff in the Chinese embassy in Berlin, in Hitler's Berlin, and he watches the rise of the Nazi Party from the embassy while also getting a master's degree from the University of Berlin in international law. And he becomes very interested in this question of efficiency, rationalization, and administration. In fact, he writes his, let's see if I can, there we go. He writes his senior thesis on what he calls diplomatic administration. Each student was required to write a senior thesis. They are hundreds of pages long and handwritten, and I do not recommend them as fun reading. But for Zhu Jianmin, what diplomatic administration means is that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is like a nerve center, while the embassies and consulates stationed abroad are the four arms and legs. And if you want the nerve center to be healthy, then you must move and exercise with all four limbs. On the other hand, to prevent paralysis of the arms and legs, the nerve center must issue commands with speed and agility. In other words, a strong diplomatic network relies on information flowing from the far-flung embassies and consulates to the center, being properly categorized and interpreted and turned into policy recommendations so that the center understands the international situation and can make proper judgments. And if you're wondering, how does someone take that little nugget of an idea and stretch it out over 400 or 500 handwritten pages? What he did is he went down the street from the school to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, started requesting documents from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs library, and he looked for any kind of inefficiency that he could spot in how the overseas embassies and consulates were being run. For example, did the distribution of personnel match the number of overseas Chinese in these various places, based on the assumption that areas with more overseas Chinese would require the most help from local consular staff? Are they spending too much money on banquets and getting too little in return? In other words, he did a full audit of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at age 22 to look for any possible reduplication of efforts or overspending of funds. And this vision of a more bureaucratized, more rationalized Ministry of Foreign Affairs was largely coming to pass, not because of Zhu Jianmin, but he was part of that process. It's during these years that you see the organizational complexity of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs not just double or triple, but grow exponentially. From an organization which had almost no specialized agencies at the start of the 1920s to one that has dozens of departments, hundreds of specialized groups working under those departments, and thousands of posts that are meant for specific kinds of experts who have specific topic expertise, right? And so by the end of the 1940s, you see an org chart that looks like this. This is a hand-drawn org chart from another one of those senior theses, in which you have a European and American affairs department that would then split into 2 different and then 3 different departments later on in the decade. You have East Asian and West Asian affairs departments, and it's becoming increasingly specialized and rationalized, and the people taking up these posts have exactly the training that is required for a specialist in Southeast Asian diaspora affairs, because they go to schools like the Party School that have bespoke curricula for these kinds of topics. So that's one angle on the kinds of work you could do coming out of the Party School, and Zhu Jianmin is somebody who stays very close to the party over the course of his career. He moves to Taiwan in 1949. He lives to the age of 102. He spends almost up until the last few years of his life, I think into his 90s, he's working at both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Diplomacy Department at Zhengda, which, even though it's no longer a party school, continues to train most of the ROC's diplomats. And to this very day, the award that's given to the highest ranked graduate of that department is named after him. This is one of his classmates who has a slightly different focus on what Chinese diplomacy should be, or what would be the solution to the problems of Chinese diplomacy. Zhou Ziyao was also a member of the first graduating class that joined in 1930 and graduated in 1933, and his early career looks basically identical to that of his classmate and close friend, Zhu Jianmin. He also goes to Berlin. He also gets a master's degree at the University of Berlin as Hitler is rising to power, but he's always been interested in a more normative idea of how to fix Chinese foreign policy. And he fixates on this idea of revolutionary diplomacy, which is also where I get the title of this talk. And in essence, revolutionary diplomacy was an idea that Chinese foreign policy should not be guided by an effort to appease the foreign powers which had unequal treaties with China. In other words, we should no longer try to abrogate these treaties by increasing our friendship with England, with France, with the United States, with Japan. Instead, we should make common cause with anti-colonial movements around the world and other recently independent countries. And he believed so much in this that he did what every college student with an amazing idea does. He founded a little political magazine called Revolutionary Diplomacy Weekly. There weren't enough people to actually write the articles, so he wrote all the articles at first and used a series of pen names. And in them, he would report on various ways that anti-colonial movements were making progress against European empires around the world, with the idea that China could emulate some of these or help some of these movements. And in this particular article, he's talking about the anti-French movement for independence in Indochina, and he's imagining how much those Vietnamese nationalists must be inspired by Chinese efforts for independence. And he invents a quote. I mean, he admits that it's an invented quote. He ventriloquizes them and says, "Comrades, our neighbor China has already risen up and is fervently fighting against imperialism. Listen, across the border from Annam, gunshots are rumbling, the imperialists of the world are defeated, and Canton is victorious. Comrades, follow in the wake of the valiant Chinese soldiers' great efforts." So there's some humor in this original vision of revolutionary diplomacy, but in fact, this normative vision of who China's allies and partners should be is going to win out, not just in the mainland, where it will become people's diplomacy after 1949, but increasingly in Taiwan, which, even though we often think about Taiwanese Cold War foreign policy as being part of an American imperium, in fact, Taiwanese diplomats were fighting for votes in the General Assembly, one country at a time in the newly independent nations, especially in Africa, after 1949, by using this kind of revolutionary anti-colonial rhetoric, drawing on China's past as a semi-colonized nation. So finally, there was a third set of ideas that I'm going to use He Qizhi to stand in for. He was a student much younger than Zhu Jianmin and Zhou Ziyao. He started in 1937, just before the outbreak of war, and the campus moved to the interior when the war broke out, so he finished school in 1941 in Chongqing. He was the highest ranked student coming out of the school when he graduated, so he was sent as a vice consul to Liverpool just as the Blitz was ending, and he also managed to get a master's degree on the side of his consular duties at LSE. But along with getting a master's degree, he and his wife, Zhu Ruohua, became involved in the underground Chinese Communist Party in the United Kingdom. They were meeting with communist organizers, and they started raising money to send back to the Chinese Communist Party in the mainland as part of the Civil War. And as soon as the Civil War ended in 1949, He and his wife both returned to the mainland to work for the new party. They had both been members of the Kuomintang. Every student at the party school had to be a member of the Chinese Nationalist Party. They had worked for the ROC government, but they came back, and He quickly began working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Chinese People's Institute of Foreign Affairs. You might also have guessed this from the way I described revolutionary diplomacy. Zhou Ziyao also stayed in China after 1949. These are two of the 50 or so people who decide to stay despite the fact that they have these political credentials, which clearly mark them as enemies of the new communist regime. Zhou Ziyao in 1946 wrote an article denouncing the Kuomintang regime after a legal case in which two American Marines had raped a student at Beida, and the Chinese government had refused to pursue justice against these Marines, instead leaving it to an American military court that decided not to pursue charges. And he said that this was a complete failure and dereliction of duty by the Kuomintang. He could not be associated with them anymore, and he gave up his position at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was very eager to join the new communist government in 1949. And both He and Zhou began in their later careers after 1949 to focus on international law. You can probably remember from the curriculum that there were a lot of courses on international law in that original set of topics that they drew up in 1930. And after 1949, for these two men, as well as many of their classmates, this becomes a potential path for China to gain international recognition and full sovereignty in the international community. This had been true for many decades, right? There are people in the first decades of the 20th century who think if we can just learn the language of international law, it will show that the unequal treaties have always been illegal and we will gain recognition and sovereignty that way. But this new generation have a much more heterodox interpretation of how international law works and how China can take advantage of this system of rules and regulations. So these are two books that He and Zhou published towards the end of their lives that sum up their work over the course of the 50s, 60s, but especially the 70s and the 80s, and the things that they had not only studied academically at places like Beida, where He was a professor, but also at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, where Zhou Ziyao was a professor. So they had studied them academically. They had also been advisors to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, advisors to the People's Liberation Army Navy, and also both members of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Treaty Committee. On the right, Gonghai, about sort of the public sea, is Zhou Ziyao's treatise about the international law of the sea. And his conclusion in this book is that it is essentially a political tool of subjugation. It has been created over the course of many centuries based on European norms and conventions and very slowly codified to reflect those norms and conventions, and therefore will always work to keep China on the outside. And if China wants to gain equality in this particular realm of international law, it has to reject the law of the sea and build its own set of norms and institutions. And in outer space law, He Qizhe uses that same framework to reach a very different conclusion about a set of laws that are only now emerging, right? He says that because this is such a new domain for international politics and international law, the European countries and the United States do not have the same advantage. We can be at the table when these laws are written, and in fact, we have to be at the table when these laws are written to make sure that they reflect Chinese interests, that they reflect interests of all non-Western nations, right? There's a vision of being able to craft a more conducive international legal environment that will allow China to pursue its aims. And these two students of the Kuomintang Party School, who began their careers in the 1930s studying international law as a tool of potential salvation for the Republic of China, end their careers using those same skills and expertise to project Chinese sovereignty into new domains overseas into outer space. So just to quickly wrap up, I've tried to make the argument that over the course of the 20th century, there is a transformation in Chinese foreign policy that begins with a structural and bureaucratic expansion and growth and reorganization, and that the contemporary foreign policy system in both China and the Republic of China relies on this vast decentralized system of experts and institutions that begin to come into being in the 1930s and 1940s and throughout the middle decades of the 20th century. At the same time, there's a strategic reorientation that's happening in which China is rethinking who its natural friends and allies are in ways that will have profound consequences for how it positions itself in the international community as it becomes an ascendant superpower in the latter decades of the 20th century. And then finally, thinking comparatively, this is a different model of how you build up diplomatic capacity and how you build up foreign policy expertise. It's a different story from the one we get if we only look at the United States and Europe. And obviously there are parts of it that are distinctly Chinese that I have tried to tease out over the course of this talk, but it also offers some sense of ways in which weaker countries, newly emerging countries, might try to establish their international presence. And it also complicates some of the things that we think about sort of how decisions are made about foreign policy in China today. You'll often hear, and it's certainly true, that Xi Jinping has centralized decision-making power in his own hands to an extent certainly not seen for several decades, but that sometimes leads people to throw up their hands and say, if we want to know what China is going to do, we have to psychoanalyze Xi Jinping, right? It's one person making all the decisions. We have to figure out what it is he thinks about, what he dreams about. And I want to push back on that and say that even as decision-making power at the very top narrows, it still rests atop this information system that collects information about the world from many different sources, interprets it at the hands of experts, and feeds that up to the upper levels of the system. And those institutions have histories of their own. They have politics embedded in them from the moment when they were created. And by studying them, the ways in which the personnel who staff those institutions are trained, we can get a better sense of this diplomatic system as a whole. Thank you so much.
Quick question to get us kicked off. You mentioned there was a number of pushbacks that people like He were trying to reset international law in favor of sort of Chinese interests. Was most of the argument what had been done up till that point was just not beneficial to them, or was there also a discussion on what specifically would be beneficial to sort of laws with Chinese characteristics to?
Yeah, so there is both, and I would say that one of the things I didn't get into as much here is this sense of a broader foreign policy ecosystem in both Taiwan and China. And that's something I'd say we'd certainly be familiar with in the United States. There are think tanks, there are universities, there's the State Department, right? And people and ideas flow pretty freely back and forth between all of those different places. And in China, right, one of the reasons that you have this persistent idea that 1949 was a moment of total rupture in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is because they fire all the ambassadors. They fire the most public-facing people and replace them with PLA generals. And because of that, right, the folks I study don't get to the highest levels of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, whereas their counterparts in Taiwan do. They become heads of departments, ambassadors to important countries. What they do instead is they become the heads of these think tanks. They sit on these advisory panels. They work at places like the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences and train hundreds of lawyers who then go work for the government and work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right? When I do the coaching tree of someone like zhengzhi, there are people who are very much still active today, still making that exact same kind of argument about the law of the sea in courts around the world today, who were trained by him in the 1980s. And it's because the black mark of their political background stops them from becoming ambassadors or very prominent leaders within the ministry, that you instead see them in this sort of semi-academic, semi-government information ecosystem, which is where they start to tease out not just, the critique of international law, but the ideas of a sort of a new version that could be more conducive. And usually what that is something that's built around a kind of global South coalition, right? I realize that's not extremely specific, but the idea is that the greater the representation of countries like China, countries friendly to China, on the governing councils, on the committees that draft the rules, the friendlier the skies will always be for China.
Questions in the room?
Thank you, Anatol. Very interesting research. I was curious if you could talk about how these professional foreign ministry or diplomats that are trained professionally thought about people's diplomacy or more private diplomacy as it related to influence operation, united front work. How did they, what were their role in sort of more unconventional approach in diplomacy of China?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think one of the things I should mention that obviously I did the archival work for this project in Taiwan, and so when I talk about the people who end up in the PRC, right, I don't have the same kind of archival record for them. I can't go to the Beijing Ministry of Foreign Affairs archive and look up every case they've ever worked on over the course of their careers, so I instead rely on things that were published about them. And then also, this was a lucky break for me, in the 1980s, the school in Taiwan, zhengzhi, went to the PRC when it was possible to start going back and looked for its own alumni. And a lot of what I know about what happened to those alumni is information that was shared with me about those trips to sort of reconnect with people who stayed. But what I kept waiting for was to find out that these old friends got back together in the 1980s, that, they had a meeting in 1991 and said, hey, look, we've been studying the exact same thing in two different political environments for the last 40 years. And I never found anything like that across the straits. I would guess that probably people who had spent the entire Maoist period having their political background used as a bludgeon against them were always a little more cautious about sort of suddenly seeming too chummy with their former classmates. I will say that the folks I study who stayed in the PRC were very active in international academic circles, especially in the 1980s after the beginning of reform and opening up. Excuse me. And I think that to some extent that reflects what I was saying to Daniel, this idea that the most effective strategy for creating an international society that's conducive to Chinese interests is being present, making sure that you are always there and voting and marshaling your friends and allies. And because a lot of this is happening, again, not in the UN General Assembly, but in the special working group for creating peace and understanding in outer space, that's like 6 lawyers who come from all over the world and meet in Geneva once a year. A lot of it is that kind of sub-diplomatic people's diplomacy or sub-national people's diplomacy that you're describing, except it's a little bit hard to differentiate it from like academic conference going, right? They kind of look identical to a certain extent for many of these people.
So to follow up on that, do you have a sense of where that 50-50 split came from? It's an interesting, is it mostly along ideological lines, or is it kind of unknown since you can't get into the archives of the PRC side?
That is to say why the 50% that stay choose to stay. Yeah, it's something I've thought about a lot, and I do not have a definitive answer. I have some partial answers. So I look at a decade's worth of graduates, and I would say that mostly, but pretty significantly, the people who stay are people who joined the program earlier in the decade. There are people who graduated in 1933, 1934, 1935, rather than in the 40s. I think that one explanation for that, or two possible explanations for that, are that the campus environment was a little more liberal, a little more conducive during the early part of the decade, especially before the war starts, when you see a much tighter control over the kinds of ideas that are allowed to be sort of voiced on campus. So in 1931, you can subscribe to the communist newspaper and it can get delivered to the campus gate every morning. You can't do that in 1938. And so I think that there is a much stronger push for ideological conformity in the Kuomintang later in the decade. And some of those leftist people who thought there was a place for them in the government and in the party have moved along by the end of the decade. But there's also just, for any group of people you're talking about, there are so many reasons why anyone would choose to go or choose to stay in 1949. A lot of it has to do with how possible it was to go, or if you had a family, if you could arrange for them to go. So I'm hesitant to say, you know, there are this one factor decides it. There are some people who clearly were extremely left sympathetic from the time they were 18, and it's not shocking at all that they choose to stay. But for many more, they seem kind of in the central blob of people who borrow ideas from both sides of the spectrum.
I have a couple questions online, but are there other questions in the room?
You started when you were sort of showing some of those headlines at the beginning. You talked a little bit about the idea that China is setting up party schools in other countries. I'm curious, sort of even aside from the Chinese-run deliberate attempts to export this to other places, do you see other countries trying to follow this model at all when you look around the world? Is it sort of viewed as a success by other governments? Is it something that especially other sort of developing countries are picking up and trying to run with in any way?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I would say that do I directly see any country that chooses to use the Kuomintang Party School in the 1930s as a model for their foreign service? I'm not going to go that far. I wish I could make that case. I wish I'd found that. But that is certainly not true. However, I do think that this idea of a party school for civil servants, which I would argue actually starts in China in the 1930s, right? There are schools for revolutionaries. There are party schools for revolutionaries in Moscow in the 1920s and 1930s, but there's nothing like this kind of civil service academy until a little bit later. That model becomes ubiquitous in single-party Leninist states, in Vietnam in the later part of the 20th century, in North Korea, certainly in the Soviet Union around the Soviet bloc. You have this sense that what we need are people who are both read and expert, which is a phrase that's used primarily in the PRC, but which can be applied to any one of these contexts in which you need people who have the technical skills and the ideological credentials. And in theory, those aren't actually two separate things. Those should inform one another. You are better at your technical function because you understand it in relation to your ideological commitments. So I think the legacy is very clear if you're looking at party states. I think you could probably make, I'm not as well informed on this, but I think, you know, outside of the Leninist sphere, you could probably make a case for Singapore as doing something similar with combining sort of party building and state building in its civil service. And I'm not as sure of how sort of foreign services are built up, say, in newly independent countries in Africa in the 1950s and 60s. I know there have been a couple articles in the last few years about that kind of topic, but I think more research remains to be done.
So you talk about you done an article research in zhengda. So have you looked at actually the curriculum of zhengda post 1949 in Taiwan, and also if that's what you already look at, how does it compare to actually the foreign, the training of diplomats in mainland China also?
Yeah, it's another good question, and I have looked at what happens to the department after 1949 when they move to Taiwan. I mean, zhengda stops being a party school even before 1949. So in, I think, 1946, it comes under the direction of the Ministry of Education rather than the Party Central Committee. But if you've spent time in Taiwan, there are sometimes jokes that zhengda kind of still is a party school. It's the school that is most closely aligned with the Kuomintang, and it's certainly the school that produces the most civil servants in Taiwan. It continues to be a good place to go if you want to join the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or any other ministry in Taiwan's government. In terms of how the curriculum changes, I would say that political control is actually much more tightly enforced in Taiwan in the 1950s and the 1960s than anything I see in the 1930s and the 1940s. And part of that is just a problem of state capacity. When you're busy fighting a war with the Japanese, fighting a civil war, it's a lot harder to make sure that the cadres at your party school aren't studying some heterodox ideas. And once they're in Taiwan, this revolutionary diplomacy current is much less present. There is a much greater sort of American Cold War influence in it, and a lot of the theories that are being taught in the classroom have a kind of communism versus democracy, freedom versus authoritarianism bent to them. In terms of what training looks like in the PRC, this is something that I have had a lot of trouble tracking down, right? There are various universities that are very tightly linked to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and that feed directly into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But in terms of what was going on in at those universities in the 1950s and the 1960s or before 1976, it's pretty difficult to get your hands on a curriculum. I wish I could, but as of now, no one has offered me one. I think that one place to look for the answer to that is the figure of Zhou Enlai, who is so closely associated with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs up until his death at the end of the Maoist period. So if you look at Chen Jian's recent biography of Zhou Enlai, you can actually see some of his work as an institution builder in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the ways in which he protects that institution from some of the most extreme excesses of the Maoist period. There are ways in which it is safer to be somebody with a right-wing background at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs during the anti-rightist campaign than it is almost anywhere else, because Zhou Enlai puts his personal credibility on the line at times to protect people who he feels are essential to the ministry's function. So it's almost a personal network, or at least what I know about it has to do with this one personal network, which involves a coalition of PLA generals who can't speak any foreign languages but have been told, congratulations, you're the ambassador to Yugoslavia, and sort of old right-wing reactionaries who went to dinner parties with Zhou Enlai and spoke French with him and are being sort of kept hidden in the basement whenever there's purge. But again, it's an area where there must have been more systematic training going on. I just don't have a sort of archival view into what it looked like at this point.
There's a question online from Rachel Holvey, who kind of parallels to what you were just talking about. Rachel Holvey is another one of current fellows at C&WP for this year. She asks, you use the term networks when you discuss the diplomats. Is there any learning or diffusion among them of certain concepts like revolutionary diplomacy?
Yeah, absolutely. There certainly is. There are ways in which these ideas travel among the party school graduates and within this network. And I think perhaps this is a disciplinary divide here between the historians and the political scientists, in that I have been a little more hesitant to approach this from the perspective of sort of network theory and trying to quantify what that diffusion looks like. I'm more able to see it when I look at the editorial board of a little political magazine that's founded in 1930, or if I sort of map out who's working for whom decades later in the legal department or the Department of, xuexiao affairs. I think that in terms of the most effective ways I've found to convey it, a lot of it has to do with Kuomintang factionalism, right? So if you map out at the start of the 1930s, there is a Kuomintang right faction that is flirting with certain fascist authoritarian ideas led by the Chun brothers. And there's also a much more left-wing faction that is closer in nature to the Communist Party and shares some ideas about revolution, and it's very much affiliated with these 2 or 3 party leaders. Then I can start to look at who was introduced to the party by one or the other of those sets of leaders, who worked with them in different embassies and ministry departments over the course of the 1930s. And that's where I start to see very clear divides emerging, sort of along ideological lines. This is going back to part of what Daniel asked me about who stays and who goes. I think that the folks who are already deeply embedded in the Chun brothers' right-wing CC clique in 1935 are not just politically and professionally bound together, they are starting to pass around a set of intellectual currents and ideas, many of them having to do with sort of administrative science, right? A lot of people think that that's an idea that comes out of fascist politics, right? A view that the state should function like a corporation, like an efficient machine, is one that, when it is extended, lends itself to certain kinds of right-wing politics, and it's also what produces something like diplomatic administration.
Thanks so much, Anatol. Learned a lot. I was wondering, following up on the question around post-1949, if you could talk a little bit more about some of the other similarities or general similarities you kind of see between the two cadres on both sides. You referenced sort of anti-colonialism. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more around the ideological point, which you had brought up, the international law, and then also, I guess this is like a much further leap, but getting to Wolf Warrior diplomacy type discussions. Like, is this something that we should care about from this perspective? Did it take place too long ago? Yeah, any discussions would be great.
So in terms of other similarities that you can see across the two groups, this is a very broad similarity, but I would say that in both cases, when I look at how their careers develop over the course of many decades, you have people who, in the way they write about their work, do not seem to be, say, primarily nationalist or think of themselves broadly as diplomats, but instead have a close personal identification with a specific set of skills and expertise, right? The sense that I am a Southeast Asia expert, I am a Europe expert, I am an international law expert, is something that I see in both groups. And again, I don't want to say that it's, distinct to these 130 people or even distinct to the Chinese case. I think it's probably true in many foreign service contexts over the course of the 20th century, but it's very different from what we would see in an earlier generation of Chinese diplomats. So just the idea of foreign policy experts who have a technocratic perspective on foreign policy issues is one way in which I see similarities across the two groups of cohorts. And then the topic area that I haven't discussed as much today, but which features pretty prominently in the dissertation, is how Chinese diplomacy should be linked to the map of overseas Chinese around the world. And that's something that is on the tip of everyone's tongue in the 1930s, right? There's an idea that, which turns out to be very true, that funding from these sort of wealthy overseas Chinese networks in Southeast Asia is going to be essential to state building. It's going to be essential for China's economic development. And China's overseas presence should basically map onto where those wealthy networks are. And not only should China have a diplomatic presence wherever there's a rich Chinatown, the ambassador or the consulate should be serving the interests of those people. We should be acting almost as if they are citizens. And depending on what citizenship laws are in place throughout the 20th century, sometimes the Chinese state does view those overseas Chinese as citizens of its own nation. So you'll see a lot of examples that I talk about in the dissertation where there is sort of anti-Chinese violence in Hanoi, and the French authorities don't want to do anything about it. And there are all of these wealthy local Chinese who have been out of China for many generations and have been rejecting the consulate's idea that they are Chinese because it has not been advantageous to them. And suddenly they need someone to go negotiate on their behalf with the Chinese government, right? And they say, you know what, maybe we are Chinese, or maybe we're Chinese for now. And that is one of the primary aims that a lot of these people have in the 1930s. And it continues on, say in the 1950s, when the apartheid regime is being constructed in South Africa. There's a not massive, but a somewhat significant Chinese population around South Africa that is very concerned that they're going to be classified along with Indians as Asiatic peoples, and that their legal classification under the new laws is going to constrain them to the sort of particular neighborhoods where Asiatic people can live. And they go to the ROC consulate right after the defeat in the Chinese Civil War, and they say, hey, this is a top priority. You need to make sure that we are classified in the same way that Europeans, or at least Japanese, are being classified in South Africa, right? So this is an enduring problem that both the ROC and PRC state will pick up after 1949, especially when the PRC is seeking sort of overseas Chinese communities as a source of foreign direct investment after the end of the Maoist period.
We have another question online from Yinan He, who's a professor at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania and also an alumni of C&WP. I wonder if you could comment on the rise and fall of the idea of revolutionary diplomacy, which I believe was most influential during the Northern Expedition, especially around early 1927 in Hankou and Zhujiang, but waned after the expedition was over and Nanjing began to consolidate power and adopt a more flexible, conciliatory approach to Western powers. Do you see a changing trend of this idea and a practice in the diplomatic training at MOFA operations from the end of the 1920s through the following decade?
Yeah, so I think that right there are some scholars, especially in Taiwan, who are doing amazing work about the history of this phrase or this idea of revolutionary diplomacy, and there's a great book called Revolutionary Diplomacy Before and After the Northern Expedition that talks about precisely this topic. I think that one way I have come to think about it is that there's a moment when revolutionary diplomacy is used as a phrase to critique the Kuomintang and critique the nationalist government, right? To say this is too much appeasement. This is, right, it's particularly after the Jinan incident, in a sense that not enough is being done to counter Japanese aggression. So that's an idea of revolutionary diplomacy from outside the regime. What I'm interested in studying throughout the 1930s and what I see staying pretty consistently true basically until the Grand Alliance at the start of World War II with the United States and the Allies, which throws this out the window because suddenly your best friends are the European imperial powers. But up until that point, there's an idea that you can have revolutionary diplomacy from within the system, not as a critique of specific Kuomintang actions, but as a little bit of a catchphrase for a different vision of how foreign policy could be practiced. And I think that that is a trend which the folks at Academia Sinica who study this topic are less focused on, but it does have a little bit of an afterlife through the 1930s. And it also becomes a sort of broader phenomenon because even as the specific phrase revolutionary diplomacy is losing some of its cachet, you see Chiang Kai-shek sort of ramping up his anti-colonial rhetoric, right? You can start to see it being worked into the Kuomintang party platform. And someone who's doing amazing work on this specific topic right now is Hao Chen, who did his PhD, I think, at Cambridge and is now a postdoc at Dartmouth. That book is forthcoming, but he's already published a few articles on exactly what it means to think about the anti-colonial foreign policy of the Chinese nationalists, both before and after 1949.
Hey, I'm a bit of an outsider to this room. I'm a visiting professor at the law school here at Columbia. So I just wanted to, one of the things I study is international law. And so I guess I wonder if you comment a little bit on the in the law school, we are horrified when anyone teaches international law who's not a lawyer. But I know international law is a subject that would have been built into the curriculum, really, and there's this idea that the lawyers would be like a separate category, that the diplomats themselves are the lawyers, right, to some degree, right? Whereas in the State Department today, there's a classic, like in the United States, like, okay, we got to get legal to review this, sign off, that sort of bureaucratization. And I guess, would you observe this as something that's not that's continued as part of the Chinese tradition, that the idea of segmenting international lawyers into like a separate professional category is less common that in the Chinese or ROC, PRC systems, and it flows out of this educational background that they have, which might be similar to the European systems as well? Or would you say that there has been more of a segmentation of law into like a separate, profession or a department which has its own sort of independent identity as intellectual matters?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really interesting one, and I'm hesitant to make any overly sweeping conclusions beyond sort of the set of actors and institutions that I'm most familiar with. I would say that idea of we better ask legal is one that I think has its counterpart in the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right? There are departments within the ministry that are explicitly staffed by lawyers and focused on making sure that particular actions and statements don't run afoul of various treaty obligations or international legal conventions. The people that I study are they're not trained or practicing lawyers, they're academics who study international law, and they would not use this phrase, but I think that I would feel comfortable saying that their interpretation of international law is that international law is just discourse. And that if you are the person in Geneva at the meeting who says the thing that gets the most applause or that gets adopted into the final readout, that is equivalent to a kind of lawmaking or convention making. And I certainly don't want to say that is the whole approach of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think it's not. I think there are some very sort of wonky lawyer legal minds involved in it as well. But I do think there's a kind of sort of international public square side of this, that their approach that they're bringing to a lot of this international convention work, international legal norm building. And that is certainly coming from people who are more on the diplomat side, more on the scholarly side. And I think it's something that for the folks I study, at least, it comes out of this real disillusionment with any faith in international law as a sort of practicable, enforceable set of rules and regulations, a mid-century disillusionment, right? A belief that the legal order embodied in the League of Nations or then in the United Nations is not sort of positivist or enforceable in the way that it's pronounced to be, and that therefore, right, you have to be willing to flout it or reshape it as is necessary. So that would be where I would start to answer that question. It's a really interesting one, and one that deserves, more thought.
There's another question online. Is there some degree of contradiction between some of the pillars, both learning from the West while also being revolutionary? How do you explain variations in the degree to which diplomatic community looks to the West versus looking from within to solve foreign policy matters?
Yeah. So I would say that I would want to answer that question in two different time periods, right? So if I'm talking about the pre-1949 period, right, then that contradiction is very much there, right? It's clearly apparent, right? The Chinese government wants diplomats who are trained in China by Chinese teachers, but they want them to have learned the Sciences Po curriculum, right? It's on display right from the start. I would say that is a contradiction that anyone who studies any kind of post-colonial nation is probably pretty familiar with, right? That happens around the world as people try to sort of indigenize their own governance tradition, but oftentimes along the lines of European or Euro-American traditions. It's sometimes called sort of a derivative discourse, right? The ways in which the thing you create in opposition to the colonial past is in many ways explicitly modeled on that colonial past. I think in the present day, I'm less sure whether I see a contradiction there. That is to say, I think that there is a conformity to a lot of diplomatic systems around the world at this point in time, right? This kind of bureaucratized, expert-driven foreign policy system is one that you would find in many, many places, not just in China, not just in the United States. And to some extent, right, there's almost a international culture of diplomats that feels apart from any national tradition. And what you are adhering to or what you're mimicking is this global professionalized group rather than the American State Department. And I say people often talk about that in relation to international law in the late 19th century, or say international organizations. They talk about like, the spirit of Geneva at the League of Nations, in which international bureaucrats create their own subculture, and what you're trying to gain access to is this denationalized set of practices rather than mimicry of any individual one. And I think that that's probably what I see in the present day more so than an attempt to emulate Euro-American standards.
How do you square that with the sort of wolf warrior diplomacy aspect? Do you could view that as professional discourse?
I mean, I try not to make any big statements about wolf warrior diplomacy because I think it doesn't lend itself well to a lot of serious scholarly scrutiny, right? I think one of the ways that, say, Peter Martin interprets it is that it's diplomacy for a domestic audience, right? The wolf warriors, they don't care who's sitting across the table from them. They don't care whether you listen to their speech. You could put in headphones and they'd be just as happy because they want to make sure that their superior, their person back in Beijing hears that they gave that speech, right? And in that sense, if you choose to view it that way, right, it's a system trying to survive under severe duress from the larger political environment in which it operates. To be honest, my sense has been that wolf warriorism is in decline and that we're seeing a lot less of this kind of berating than we did a few years ago. And even then, it was a somewhat limited set of events. I think that people found it wasn't an extremely effective style of diplomacy, shockingly. And that, say, you know, Rachel a couple weeks ago was talking about this idea that China has an image problem, right? And that when they're seeking to build up international coalitions, they find that even countries which seem to have aligned interests around the world, but think that working with China has sort of a negative ring to it. I think that when they're trying to counter that particular problem, having a reputation as the folks who show up at the meeting table and yell at you for 45 minutes is pretty counterproductive. And I would assume that we will continue to see less of it as we have in the last year or so.
That makes sense. Any other questions in the room? No? All right, well, thank you very much for your time. And everyone should join us next week when we host the Japan Symposium on the 18th.